Welcome to the session where we'll be discussing Resurgence of Protectionism, the return of industrial policies. I'm Ahmed Elsafty, an economic researcher at the ECSSR, and I'll be moderating this session. First and foremost, I genuinely cannot express how enthusiastic I am to moderate one of the first sessions of the very first edition of such an ambitious forum, Hili Forum. And part of this excitement really goes to the topic, a topic that has captured my attention over the past few years. The recent rise in protectionism, characterized by the growing implementation of trade barriers and restrictions by nations to shield their domestic industries from external competition, has become a concerning trend. This development has significantly impacted global trade, raising apprehensions about the future of globalization and economic interdependence. While protectionist measures may be viewed as a response to trade, conflicts, and geopolitical challenges, they pose a threat to the sustainability of vital industries and could potentially lead to deglobalization again. And I truly cannot think of better people to discuss such an interesting topic than the absolutely terrific panelists we have in here. His Excellency, Ambassador Abdulnasser Jamal Alshaali, UAE Ambassador to the Republic of India, and Dr. Mohan Kumar, former Ambassador of India to France and Bahrain, and current Professor of Diplomatic Practice at the Jindal School of International Affairs and Jindal Global University in India. And we have Dr. Bassem Kamar, Chief Economist of the Central Bank of the United Arab Emirates. And last but not least, we have Dr. Ahmed Elsafty, and amongst his all outstanding accomplishments, he is currently an economic advisor at the ECSSR. So I'll start the session, but before I start, I'd like to notify our audience to scan the QR code to share your comments, questions, which will be discussed with our wonderful lineup. So my first question is going to be for you, Your Excellency. So what are the underlying drivers for protectionism, and what factors are contributing to the resurgence of protectionism in global trade?
Am I audible? Excellent. Thank you, Mohammed, and thank you all for joining us here today. So two big factors, I think, in my personal opinion. One is this understanding or perception that we are all competing for limited resources, and so the faster you get to a larger stake in whatever that you're trying to manufacture, the better it is. The second is that we're also competing on limited market access. And if we are looking at countries competing in a certain industry or in a certain sector, from the outlook, it would seem like this is something logical and something that actually makes sense. But the matter of fact is you're only competing or able to compete in an industry or in a sector that you have absolutely no advantage in by either subsidizing your industry or your sector, or by imposing some sort of a tariff, tax, quota, whatever you want to call it, on whatever that you're importing from those other countries to be able to compete. What I find personally fascinating is that over the last few years, and this happened prior to COVID, during COVID, and extended to sometime after COVID, quite a few policies or quite a few agendas around the globe when it comes to protectionism have been driven by political interest. So to give you a very specific example, and maybe this doesn't necessarily address industries or sectors, but deals with something that finances all of that. And this is being listed by the Financial Action Task Force. And I remember back in the day, there were two theories in the UAE government. Is this politically motivated? Or is this just a technical problem that we need to deal with? And obviously, for the longest time, the politically driven agenda was the one, was the prevalent one, until we came to the understanding that no, we actually do have a few technical matters that we need to address. Yes, there is some political agenda involved in this, But if we address the technical matter, and then we use our bilateral relations, we should be able to circumvent this, and that's what actually happened. This is important because when you take a look at everything that's happening globally, we are moving towards more protectionism. We're moving towards more fierce competition when it comes to key sectors, emerging sectors, and technologies. And the question is, can this be something that we can sustain in the long term? Because this used to happen in the past. The industries have changed. The sectors have changed. At certain points in history, countries have changed as well from that point onwards. So what's next? And if we keep going in this direction, what's going to happen to all that cooperation that happened during COVID, interest in recovering from the impact, so on and so forth?
An excellent point, Your Excellency. And this actually brings me to my next question, which is going to be for you, Dr. Ahmed. So as countries risk being caught in cycles of increasing tariffs and barriers, how will industrial policies such as Made in China, European Chips Act, affect overall economic growth, so the global economic growth?
Thank you so much, Mohammed, for the question. Actually, the basic idea of industrial policy and how there is a sort of a resurgence of this type of policy, again, is related somehow to what's going on from the geopolitical point of view, and because of the different shocks that happen to the economy. Some of the shocks are negative shocks, like we saw, related to, for example, the supply chain. Supply chain, when you have problems with the supply chain, when you know that you depend like 90% of your supplies from one supplier, and if this supplier has some problems, then you have to act according to it. So you have to do something about it for the national security aspects. But it's not only the sort of negative shocks like the ones that I mentioned regarding the impact of COVID, but you have positive shock, like for example, the new or the fourth industrial revolution. With the fourth industrial revolution, you have two sides of this thing. First of all, it's sort of going to change the structure of the economy, of the economic transactions, and so on. So you have a sort of opportunities for the countries who are gaining advance in this side of the aspects. But at the same time, there are one aspects that can impact the sort of industrial policies and lead to populism, is that everybody is worried about this new industrial revolution. Because, for example, for AI, everybody's talking about loss of jobs. Okay, so now you have to worry about the loss of jobs and you have to create jobs. Okay, so in this sense, you have to react. And for industrial policies in general, it shows peaks and down over time. Usually, when it comes opportunities with industrial revolutions, things like that, it picks up and then it goes down with, for example, like globalization. But now it picks up again. And the interesting facts about it, it peaked up very strongly during the last couple of years. So if you start to think about how industrial policy, which is a little bit different from protectionism, because it's not mainly protectionism. Protectionism is against trade, but this, you can give subsidies, you give tax incentives for for local industries, or to attract investors in your country. The main point here is that when you think about it, the last few years, first of all, there was a peak in the measures taken under what you can call industrial policy, either support for domestic businesses, or to attract domestic businesses, or to close the door against some sort of imports. But the noticeable things, and this is from both the IMF and the WTO research, is that first of all, there was a research of this type of measurements. The second thing, which was very interesting, is that almost 50% of the industrial policy measures that have been taken lately been done by three parties. China, US, and EU. The third thing is that even though it's supposed to be helping developing your economy, 2/3 of it is trade distortive. So it's against trade. So all those things sort of make you think about the cost for certain parties. First of all, the economic efficiency, because even though sometimes you have a motivation to do industrial policy, for example, if you have market failure, so in this sense, you try to correct the market failure by intervention by the government. Sometimes for development reasons, like everybody is giving example of the Asian countries, Japan, Korea and China and their policies, the industrial policies, and how they succeeded in this. But there is one aspect that we all lose focus on. Okay, you have industrial revolution, you have industrial policies, and mainly from advanced economies, as I mentioned, 3 main parties. But how about the impact on the developing countries? And okay.
And this is actually, yeah.
Okay, so I'll stop here.
Thank you. A collection of interesting points have been made by Dr. Ahmed. So my next question actually is going to be for you, Dr. Bassem. Should governments actively intervene in the economy by enacting industrial policies to bolster certain industries in the country, or should they take a hands-off approach and let markets dynamic dictate industry?
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today, surrounded by such a group of intellectuals and brains, and also such a great audience listening. So thank you very much for the invitation. I will just take it from the end. Should the government let the market handle the invisible hand? Well, we have seen what the invisible hand is capable of doing. We have seen global warming, we have seen climate disasters, we have seen global financial crisis. So the market is not always efficiently functioning. And certainly, the government have a role to play. And if we take it one step back, we talk today about the regain or the return of protectionism. But before, we have been talking since the beginning of the 90s on globalization. And before that, the globalization started because we had lots of protectionist policies, especially in emerging markets. So let's have one step back. Why did emerging markets impose such protectionist measures, and did they pay off and impact the economy? Number one, they had a very large current account deficit. So they couldn't really maintain reserves. They were running into exchange rate crisis. So they had to find a way to limit, to reduce trade a little bit, and eventually, through operating behind very high barriers, they can attract industries to come and invest in the country. But in which industry? I can give you an example, like a country I know well, Egypt. Back in time, tariffs on automobile, on cars, were something like between 200 and 300%. So a car in Europe that is $10,000 will be in Egypt $30,000. Very, very expensive, and not allowed to import any used car. This attracted lots of manufacturers like BMW, Mercedes, Toyota, and others to come and operate in the Egyptian market. Why such a high tariff for this sector? It was a deliberate action. They wanted to reduce imports from one end, but on the other end, they wanted to create labor-intensive industry with plenty of supplies coming from different suppliers to this automobile, which have something like 300 plus component. So all this was a strategy by the government. At the time, actually, for the anecdote, I ran my own first business where I was just dismantling cars in Europe, shipping them to Egypt and reassembling them behind this high tariff to make use of this very high price. So protectionism helped at some point. And then WTO came in 1995 and changed a little bit the rule of the game, giving some years of some time for countries to adjust and to adapt. But actually, it helped all these industries to grow and to flourish. So yes, there is a need for the governments to come, to step in, to intervene, and to correct for some market failure, which if they leave the invisible hand to act on its own, it might take, decades to happen, and the country cannot afford to have, such a pain.
Thank you. This is a really great insight, which brings us to my next question, which is going to be for you, Your Excellency. So, can protectionism by any means be justified in the context of national security, sovereignty? Can it be justified? Can there be any justification?
So there is first of all, thank you very much. And I want to pay compliments to the organizers. I mean, it's hard to believe this is the first edition of the Hili Forum. I'm wondering what the second and third will look like. This is already superb, and I give you 10 out of 10. So thank you very much for having me. No, the answer to your question, there is a legal answer and a political answer. The legal answer has to be no, because the WTO rule is very clear. We have a security exception, a national security exception, Article 21, if I remember, in the GATT, which is the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which clearly says you can have a national security exception only when you are at war with each other. So I remember discussing this several years ago when I was a young diplomat. So legally, you have to invoke the national security exception, which, by the way, Mr. Donald Trump invoked to impose duties on steel and aluminum on India. And we tried telling him that India and the US are not at war with each other. At least we don't think so. But I don't think he would listen. So that's the legal answer. The political answer, frankly, to the question is, as my friend to my left has said very eloquently, the three major players in the world, United States, EU, China, US, China, EU, whichever order, they have already embarked on what you can call protectionist, what others will call industrial policy. China forever has had a pride of place for state-owned enterprises. So they have industrial policy, no question. Americans have now the Inflation Reduction Act and the Chips and Science Act. Whichever way we look at it, it is to protect domestic industry. And Europe has just released a report which I would encourage the audience to read by Mario Draghi. It's a 400-page report. It's essentially a charter for protectionism. Europe basically says we don't want to lose competitiveness to the United States and China. So we have to protect our industry. Now, my question to you is, what do developing countries and others do? First, even if you want to protect or you want to resort to protectionism, three conditions are important. First, you must have an efficient state. You guys are lucky in the UAE. You have an efficient state. But I can be honest about India, and I have to my right the illustrious UAE ambassador to India, who will bear me out. But in his diplomatic status, he may not agree. But I can afford to be honest because I've retired. Indian state is not efficient as it should be. We are trying to be efficient, but we are not. So if you don't have an efficient state, you have a problem. If you don't have a state which is uncontested, you have a problem. There are some federal countries where the state is contested. And lastly, you need policy continuity in a state. So if you have an American kind of system where you have 4 years of Biden and then you have suddenly Mr. Donald Trump, there is no continuity.
So actually, on the same question, I would like to hear from you, Your Excellency. So how can protectionism, like we have the economic escalation, what you just described. So on the other hand, we have the main arguments against protectionism are outlined as market distortion, loss of economic efficiency. So how can they be justified while we have the same main counter argument of protectionism?
Okay, so the reason you generally have protectionism, whether it's in a specific tech industry sector, emerging technologies, or maybe previously in producing certain commodities and so on, is because with time, comparative advantage, which is at the core of all of this, shifts from one place to another. So when you manufacture, for instance, a pen in a certain country and it costs a certain amount, that will not continue to be the case as you elevate more people out of poverty, as you start creating more jobs, income per capita increases, so on and so forth, and this shifts to another country. And so what has happened is that advantage in quite a few sectors have already shifted away from countries like the United States, from the EU, and is now slowly shifting away from China as well to countries like Vietnam, India, and a couple of other places. But then once those countries also get to a certain level of income per capita, that advantage will also continue to shift. And so protectionism is this last attempt or resort to try and revive as much competitive advantage in so-and-so sectors as possible, just to make sure that you stay relevant and significant in a world that has moved away from you. Now, can you do this and sustain it in the long term? Not really, because when things have changed when they took a dramatic kind of turn between the US and China, you saw quite a few companies shifting their operations and their manufacturing facilities to Vietnam and India. So what happens tomorrow when Vietnam is too rich, or when India is the third largest economy in the world? Where are you going to shift next? And are Vietnam and India going to impose protectionist measures to make sure that they can maintain the competitive advantage for as long as possible? It's not sustainable. That's the main point. And businesses are quite smart in the sense that, yes, states can be efficient, but businesses are way too efficient because it's a cost, revenue, profit kind of equation. And the business is going to be wherever they can manufacture it with a certain level of service and sell it to certain markets. If the UAE had a protectionist mentality, now just to see it the other way around, because investment-related incentives have been mentioned, and we do have plenty of them. We have the golden visa. We're trying to get businesses here. We want them to set up shop, but we don't do it in a way where we say it's either or. We do it in a way where we say, if you think you can manufacture in India, and that's a good costing formula for you, we want part of the value chain. And we can offer you the infrastructure, the ease of doing business, government efficiency, and then being able to sell to other markets because of the CPAs that we have with other countries in the region.
Thank you, Your Excellency. So now my next question is going to be for you, Dr. Ahmed. Are these concerning shifts, protectionism, return of industrial policies, and so forth of these shifts are solely a consequence of escalating geopolitical tensions, or are there additional contributing factors?
I think one part of the answer is not only the geopolitical situation. The geopolitical situation, part of it is the shift that happened in technology, for example. So this is one thing. We have a number of things that are happening. It's not only about the geopolitics. Again, climate change. This is one thing that everybody is paying attention to it now, and you need to have sort of a supply chain to be able to achieve your climate goals. Okay, but at the same time, if you notice that there are some sort of monopoly over certain aspects of the supply chain. For example, if you talk about rare earth minerals and the ability to manufacture them, it's mainly in China. When you talk about solar panels, again, it's China. And one major complaint about this, usually from industrial countries like in the EU, is that China is supporting, the government of China is supporting those industries. They are pushing for those industries to gain competitive advantage. And at the same time, and this is actually, I heard it from somebody from Europe, is that, okay, for us, we are the one who started the solar panels industry. And when we allowed China to come into our market, our industry vanished, even though that we are the ones who started this industry. Again, when you think about the EVs, for example, and the competition going on. So it's not only geopolitics. It's a matter of being able to keep investment, to keep market share, to keep sort of jobs, to keep the supply chain inside. All of those factors within the industrial countries, without the big three players, are the main factors behind trying to apply protectionism and sort of industrial policies. Because again, we are shifting, the economy, the global economy is shifting because of technology, because of the shocks, and you have to be able to solve some of the major problems on the company level and at the same time on the population level, because again, as I mentioned before, you don't want to lose jobs. Okay, so it's again, this is I think those are the main reasons behind the sort of competition and the rise of protectionism and the industrial policies right now.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmed. Seems like we still talk about the idea of shielding the domestic market. My next question, Dr. Bassem, does protectionism genuinely support and revitalize domestic industries? When we are talking about a trade deficit and improving a trade deficit, does it really revitalize the?
Well, if we just look back at what we call the comparative advantage theory, and that all countries should specialize in what they have a comparative advantage in. Okay, just take it one step back. And let's take an example where we have two countries. We have the US, who can produce food, wheat, because they have the land, they have the technology, and they have very competitive, actually. They can produce it cheaper than anybody else. And then you have Europe, where they are very advanced in technology, in machinery, think Porsche, Ferraris, and so on. And they will specialize in produce machines. Think that we take this to the extreme, and Europe specialize in producing machines, and the US producing food, and they trade, and they are all better off. But suddenly, in the US, we have a very bad harvest. You have half of the production. What will the European eat? So that's why actually we have some sectors have to be protected for national security, among which food, and that's why in Europe we have the common agriculture policy that is subsidizing farmers and so on. So yes, there is still a room, and it helps, it works actually effectively, and major players accept it. To go back to the example of His Excellency Dr. Kumar. So, once we establish the rule of the game, imagine, a game theory where we have a two-princess dilemma. If we move to a situation where all countries agree on free trade, we're all better off. All goods are going to be cheaper, consumers will benefit, things will be better. If we all impose tariffs, to be the opposite, we're all losing. But once we move to the globalization era, and all countries abide by the rule of the game, if one player just moves to protectionism, he is the one who is maximizing his benefit to the extent of all the others. And this is unfortunately what is happening. So we can see this actually action from the US, but not only, on trying to regain some advantages through imposing protectional barriers. So yes, it works, it helps, and it's been used very efficiently by different countries.
Thank you, Dr. Bassem. I'd like to hear from you, Your Excellency. How effective are the protectionist policies?
So there are two things. One, I agree with the UAE ambassador to India. In the long run, it is not sustainable. I am absolutely convinced. Because it becomes a zero-sum game. If you can do it, I can do it, somebody else will do it. So I think it cancels itself out. Having said that, the economists like to use the infant industry argument. And every developing country, even Japan did it, by the way. It's hard to believe. Even Japan, in the initial stages, protected their automotive industry and then became a giant. So India, because we've had a socialistic background, much more than others, we believe that some industries need to be protected. For example, we protected the pharmaceutical industry in India. We did not use advanced patents. We believed in generic drugs. But that's important for India because in India, we don't have 100% healthcare. And if you start selling an asthma inhaler for $100, a lot of Indians will die. They just don't have the capacity to buy it for $100. So we had to believe in generic medicines. So to answer your question, there is an infant industry argument where least developed and developing countries have to protect their industry. But I would make two conditions or caveats. One, you cannot do it indefinitely. Number two, you have to kind of move to a rules-based system, which is why in the WTO, we give what is known as transition periods for countries like India. India had 10 years to bring itself into conformity to intellectual property rights. Other countries have 10 years to do other things. That is something you have to give. Otherwise, I think it's like the mutually assured destruction in the nuclear era, where you have a nuclear weapon, I have a nuclear weapon. We keep threatening to use it. It makes no sense.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Now, my question is going to be for you, Dr. Bassem. So, given the escalating competition among major economies, how can countries impacted by these challenges respond, especially the developing countries?
Actually, it's a little bit difficult. One of the policies that I might need to think of is really going regional, having regionalization policy, creating new blocks. His Highness, His Excellency, Dr. Sani mentioned this, a little bit earlier. So this is a movement that we can see. It's just together we stand, divided we fall. So the European Union have been created around this same idea that we have to get together as a bloc. And if we take the example of the UAE, which is actually the UAE have been shows globalization as an engine of its growth. You talk about logistics, transportation, you name it. So we need to have this well-functioning international system. So one thing is to build a strong regional bloc within the GCC, within the Arab countries, with Africa is very important to have, this strength. Number two is to try to maintain balanced ties between the two blocks, because they are eventually in tension, in confrontation, and you don't to take any side. It's very difficult as well. But a country like the UAE have been doing this very efficiently. The third one is to maintain the dialogue. And again, the UAE have been in the forefront of organizing forums, hosting WTO meetings, hosting COP28 meetings, and so on, to really try to bring all these divergent views together around the table to sit and to discuss, because there is no way out away from discussion. Otherwise, it's going to be more and more tensions. So I think these are the three angles that I believe would help eventually emerging markets and developing countries.
Brilliant. So, Your Excellency, we have, on one hand, we have developing countries. On the other hand, we have developed countries. How do emerging economies respond to protectionist policies from developed nations? So the difference between developed and developing, and knowing the most impacted countries being the developing countries, how can they ensure the balance?
So it's going to be extremely difficult for them to move past a certain income level, be able to create jobs, until and unless those developed nations come up with a formula where they jointly invest in those countries to create jobs, to generate employment, to increase income, so on and so forth. And this is why this is dangerous. So it's not just a matter of it being a zero-sum game between developed countries, but also a matter of, so how does this impact countries that should be manufacturing certain products in certain industries, because they should be naturally having that advantage to do so, but you're not allowing them to do so because you're protecting your own industry at a stage that's way past its infant stage. This is an example, since we spoke about national security as well and related matters, and since you also know about the food security angle that I always like to present, I don't know if this is still the case, but until very recently, a few years ago or so, Japan had an 800% tariff on rice imports, right? And if you think about it, rice, like for us and for certain countries, rice is a political commodity. It has nothing to do with an advantage. It has nothing to do with trying to compete because Japan is not an international player when it comes to the rice market. But it's just to make sure that they have certain supplies for their own population without having to rely on a fragile and unpredictable market. With countries deciding not to export certain commodities and so on and so forth. And so that's why, yes, there are very specific conditions. So if the UAE was, producing rice, we shouldn't be selling it to the market, to the international market, because it's an important commodity for us. But if this is not an extreme scenario, an extreme situation, then what would be done by developed nations or nations who have already surpassed their infancy stage when it comes to certain industries is harming more countries than it's benefiting their own economies or their neighboring economies around them.
I see a large smile from you, Your Excellency. Would you like to have or to add any new insight on your perspective on?
No, I have 3 points to make, and thank you very much for giving me the floor. First, these are my conclusions, but not all of them is borne out by the discussions today. But since you're giving me the opportunity, for which I thank you very much. Number one, I see the the concept of globalization being replaced by geopolitics. I think we are finished with the era of unbridled globalization. I don't want to say globalization is over, but I'm saying geopolitics is ruling the roost. Secondly, I would say that trade and investment have become reciprocal and are not going to be based on an MFN system, most favored nation. I think people are going to trade with countries with which they can have trust. And the Americans call it small yard and high fence. But whatever you want to call it, in other words, if you are trading in undergarments, shoes, even if it is Christian Louboutin, Gucci, that is non-strategic. I don't care where you get it from. You get it from China, you get it from wherever you want. But if it's going to be semiconductors, if it's going to be solar panels, if it's going to be active pharmaceutical ingredients for my pharmaceutical industry, I'm not going to depend on one country. The American Commerce Secretary, no less, Raimondo, is on record as having said, we are dangerously dependent on Taiwan for semiconductors. Taiwan is, by the way, a country or whatever you want to call it, which United States supports. But they say it's dangerous dependency. Last but not least, and this is my point, I will finish in a minute, the WTO has to be completely renegotiated. The WTO was based on the Washington Consensus. It was based on free trade. But we know the Washington Consensus is dead. The state is back. So we have to renegotiate the WTO completely. Take MFN. I've already said MFN is dead. Take national treatment. But people are protecting domestic industry, which is the opposite of national treatment. Take subsidies. Every country is subsidizing, including US, including EU, including China, all of which are WTO inconsistent, by the way. Whether you give subsidies to semiconductors, it just doesn't make subsidies very good in the eyes of WTO. It will still be illegal, what you're doing. So we have to renegotiate the WTO. There is no other way. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Dr. Ahmed, we've been speaking about the absence, the lack of, let's say, presence of the IGOs, while talking about the protectionism and the rising and the resurgence of, let's say, protectionism and all. So with the protectionism threatening to undermine the effectiveness of the WTO and other IGOs, can reforms make any difference?
As His Excellency mentioned, it's a must. Because, again, if you look at the major international economic organizations like the WTO, the IMF, and I'm going to talk about those two specifically. Forget about the World Bank right now. But His Excellency mentioned about the WTO and how it needs to be completely overhauled. But when we talk about the IMF specifically, let's think about the countries who have major economic problems right now. And again, it's related to having an external economic problems. So usually you have a balance of payments problem, and the IMF would come to help you, will give you money, conditional on applying certain economic, taking certain economic measures. Usually the IMF would come and tell you that, okay, what the major problems that you have is that you lack foreign financing, you have major problems with your balance of payments, you have high debt, you have problems with the exchange rate, and the solutions are comprised of three parts. The first part, we have to do a demand reduction, sort of reducing your demand. You have excess demand. So you have to increase the interest rates, you have to cut government spending, you have to increase taxes. And at the same time, you have major issue with your currency, and then you have to depreciate your currency, okay? And then, which is, I think, is an afterthought, you have to do some structural reforms because they are never really involved in major structural reforms. So the major problem here is that they are asking you to cut the government spending, increase taxes, and at the same time, devalue your currency, increase your interest rates. And some part, and this is always happening, whatever the situation of the global economy. So 2016 is like 2023. No difference. Same program will apply. The only thing is that, okay, when you increase the interest rate and you devalue your currency, you will have a chance in the short term to attract portfolio investment, meaning that foreigners are coming to invest in your government securities. So you close your financing gap. But when you do the rest of the reforms, then the foreign direct investment will show up after that in the longer term. So what they are saying is that in the short term, you have to depend on hot money, meaning that you have people can borrow with cheap interest rate outside, bring the currency to your economy because you have high interest rate, and this will continue temporary for them till the foreign direct investment will pick up. But how the foreign direct investment will pick up with what's going on with protectionism, with industrial policies in developed countries, and at the same time you have lots of restrictions on your government spending, on your way of interfering in the market. All of those things don't make sense altogether. So again, you have to look at it from a different perspective. One final thing about this, okay? Usually, you have some, I would say, some sort of interest in developing countries from one of the rising stars, like what happened with China, for example, under the Belt and Road Initiative, okay? So they come to you because they have excess funds that they need to invest abroad, they need to open markets, and they need to be close to the resources. So they have a sort of a plan that helps them at the end. But they offer you something. Maybe it's not the best. We saw the problems with, for example, with what we call debt traps. We have major problems with the efficiency and some other major issues with some of their projects. But when the other parties come to you and tell you, okay, be worried about this, don't do this, they don't offer you much instead. So if China is not going to invest in an African country, who's going to invest? Who's going to provide the alternative for this? So again, this is a major issue. You have to think about it. You have, for an organization like the IMF, they have to consider some parts that they are not considering right now. For example, the geopolitical analysis of the risks associated with the countries, how the countries can compete under the current circumstances, how those countries will be able to attract foreign direct investment under the current situation, how you can make your package of policies flexible according to the time frame that you are talking about, and at the same time the country conditions. Those are big questions that I think international organizations like the IMF need to answer.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmed. Your Excellency, a question about the same discussion point about the IGOs and WTO. So how can the WTO and other IGOs be revitalized for a more effective role? So is it the best for the global economy for them to have, like for the ITO and IGOs, to have a more effective role?
Yes, but it's not going to be. Yes, but it's not going to be possible if countries do not accept such a stronger role. So the problem has always been that we had the GATT, and then after the GATT, the WTO came forward. There were certain some sort of an agreement on that we shouldn't have subsidies in certain industries, that countries should have X number of years to be able to move away from certain policies that they have. But for example, when it comes to no consensus agreement whatsoever, and this is still a point of contention. That's still a point of contention until today. And so, if you look around you, there is no organization other than the WTO who can actually muster such a role and be able to bring everyone and have a fruitful, constructive conversation and discussion. But the problem is, it's only going to happen if countries do accept that the WTO is going to be the organization to negotiate such matters and to basically settle disputes as well.
Thank you, Your Excellency. My next question is going to be for you, Dr. Bassem. What are the potential short-term and long-term effects of protectionist policies on the global economy? And is there a path to a more equitable international trade system?
Excellent question. Thank you very much. Before I proceed, I just want to make a comment on the reform of WTO and of the IMF. And even this morning, we had a very interesting session when we were discussing the reform of the United Nations. I had, the chance of working for the IMF for something like 12 years. And let me just tell you this: if any country want to take a loan from the IMF, the board of directors of the IMF will have to agree at 85% of the voting. The US have 17%. So if anyone wants to get a loan and US says no, it's no. Okay. How can you reform this? The US will have to accept, for example. UN, they have a veto system that gives a privilege to some countries. How can you reform this? So while I believe we still need to dialogue and to try to reform these institutions, it might be difficult and long. So in the absence of this perspective in the short term, what else? What can countries do? And one thing that the UAE is doing very well is to have bilateral free trade agreements, binding bilateral trade agreements. Why is this? Because we need to make a hub for foreign direct investment to come to the UAE, to invest in the UAE, and to be able to export to as many countries and as many markets worldwide. So one alternative to, until waiting for all this organization to reform, which might be a little bit difficult, there are other alternatives. And that's why the impact of having some protectional policies on the short term will have winners and losers. Some will gain. Those, again, who will implement those measures first might get away with it. Others might retaliate. But the medium-long-term impact will be a loss for the entire, for the whole world, actually, for the entire global trade system and investment system. Because we all want to have free supply of global value chains, free movement of goods across countries. So going back very often leads to more tensions and eventually to political conflicts. So we need to keep the dialogue engaged very actively and try to dismantle this global fragmentation, as we call it, from exacerbating even more.
Thank you, Dr. Bassem. Your Excellency, what is the likely trajectory in the years to come?
So the trajectory, I wish I could tell you that it's fantastic and it's all going to be milk and honey and so on. I think it's going to be choppy waters, frankly. I see the juxtaposition of two systems. We will still have a residual global value chain, which is really an aftermath of the previous globalization model. That will continue. For example, of course, Bangladesh is going through a difficult time, but otherwise Bangladesh was an important part of the garments value chain. So some such value chains will continue. I will call it the residual value chain because that applies to the older model. But I think a new value chain is being sought to be put in place. And the short code used is resilient supply chains. And what they mean by resilience, frankly, for those who are uninitiated in trade, is you don't want to depend on one country, whether it is China or Taiwan or whatever. So the resilient supply chains are sought to be built for technologically important areas. Semiconductors, I gave the example, but all the critical minerals, for example, lithium, electric vehicles, batteries, you're going to have a completely different value chain. India, I can only speak for India, and that may offer an answer to your question. India is trying very hard because we miss the global value chains, Mohammed. India was not part of the global value chains. I'm being honest, and that's why we lost out. We are trying hard not to repeat the mistake by getting on to the resilient supply chains. US has just included India along with 18 other countries for the semiconductor value chain. We are part of the Minerals Security Partnership, 18 countries. India and EU have a Trade and Technology Council. So we believe the only way, if you look at a country like India, the challenges are enormous because of the scale. The only thing which can get us out of problems is technology. It is not possible for India to do what China did, which is move people from agriculture, ask them to make Nike shoes, ask them to make toys, ask them to make luggage. There is enough Nike shoes for the world and twice over. Each one of us can have 10 Nike shoes. So what is India going to do by bringing value to have more Nike shoes? No point. So we have to think of something else. And the only thing that countries like India can do is use technology to somehow avoid what is known as the middle income trap. Because India really runs the risk of falling into that trap. We don't have a highly literate population. The few people who are literate in India are very highly literate. But then the vast majority of the population is not highly literate. That's the problem we have. So I think one way to do it is to rediscover your competitive strength in technology. That'll be my brief answer.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Dr. Ahmed, would you like to enrich us with a different perspective on that, what the future hides for the global economy?
Actually, I have to agree with His Excellency that it looks not very optimistic. Okay, I'm not saying it's pessimistic, but I would say that it's not looking very optimistic right now. But there are like sources of light around you. For example, if you look at ASEAN, again, as my friend Dr. Bassem Kamar mentioned, regional integration, for example. If you think about ASEAN, if you think about countries that can help each other or can find a sort of common interest like BRICS Plus, and I would have to mention India here because India is one of the key players who can really work with everyone. This is one major issue. So you find India, for example, with BRICS, but at the same time they have excellent economic relations with the West. Okay, so you have to find those sort of things to be able to navigate what's going on in the global economy right now. It's not an easy task. Some of the countries do not have the leverage to do something like that. But I think the right approach is to look at your neighbors first, how to cooperate with your neighbors, and then you expand from this. For example, if you think about Africa, you can have lots of value chains not based on one country, but within the group of countries that they can help each other, okay? That they can integrate this. You have basic also, again, this is another major advantage because of the SMEs and even micro businesses. Those sort of businesses can work fine within the developing nations. The idea is how to move from being local to being integrated into the global value chain. This is the major thing here to do. So again, with the right set of policies, with the right support from the international community, where including reforming international economic organization, those countries can at least not be ignored within what's going on in the global economy right now.
Thank you, Doctor.
You're welcome.
Your Excellency, would you like to increase the level of optimism regarding the future global economy?
Yes, but only when it comes to the UAE, I think. Because you rightfully mentioned that we're signing quite a few CEPAs with multiple countries. And I think the way we look at the world is very different than how the world looks at itself. We are moving in a very different direction when it comes to connecting different markets. You mentioned that India is quite good, with BRICS, but also quite good with the EU. And I think we also have that advantage, maybe even to a greater extent, that we can literally work with everyone. And we have been working with everyone. So when you look at the UAE and what's happening in the UAE, it's quite significant. The numbers show for it in terms of economic growth, size of the economy, the increase in trade when it comes to, especially countries that we have signed CEPAs with, but also other countries, some of which are quite far away from us. And this ties in nicely with this whole building a resilient supply chain post-COVID-19. Now, what's happening globally is, I think, going to continue as a trajectory. It doesn't seem like it's going away. The only thing that you will see is that you wouldn't be seeing all countries fighting with each other at the same time. Instead, you will see blocks of countries, the small yard high fence theory, happening with certain countries in their neighborhoods and maybe with countries beyond their neighborhood. And you will see it happening in terms of blocks and regions rather than all countries fighting all countries at the same time when it comes to protectionism and when it comes to trade. Now, that being said, it's not equal across all sectors. It's not equal across all industries. You would see more emphasis and highlight when it comes to semiconductors, manufacturing of chips, and all the applications that are associated with that, including supercomputing, AI, even when it comes to data centers and attracting companies to invest in data centers, so on and so forth. And you will see it at a different level when it comes to other sectors that might only be important from a local domestic point of view, or like the rice example in Japan, for instance. And that's where the level would be different when it comes to protectionism. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. Now it's time for the audience's questions. We have an interesting question that I would like to hear your answers for, is how can countries affected by this wave of protectionism meet the challenge? How can they meet all these challenges? Dr. Ahmed, starting with you.
Again, I have to refer to the experience of UAE and India here, is that being able to deal with everyone. This is the basic idea. You don't have to take side. Okay, you have your own interests, you have your own economic interests, and at the same, you can deal in some parts with one of the powers, the competing powers, and you can deal on some other aspects with other power here in this sort of tug of war, if we can say so. So this is one thing. The second thing is that it's not like, even with industrial policy and protectionism, you still can find way. Again, it's not the right set of policies all the time. Not all countries can play this game. Okay, the second, the major problem with developing countries, I think, when you apply protectionism, is that you can create lots of distortions inside the market. You can sort of create a possibility for corruption, for example, and at the same time, you can waste really scarce resources for you. So opening up is not going to be a disadvantage for you, but you have to work this way, but you have to discover or rediscover your comparative advantage here. You have to be very flexible, okay? But at the same time, again, international support is very important. Without the international support for many countries, it will be very difficult for you to achieve your objective or even survive or navigate what's going on right now.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmed. Your Excellency, would you like to?
Not to give you a long answer, but I am convinced, one positive and one negative point. Life is unfortunately like that. I think countries which innovate and absorb technology will be winners in this game. But equally, countries which do not have a population which can absorb technology will be losers. So the problem with this new paradigm is that it will not leave you where you are. You can be absolutely sure. That is not a choice. You will either be a winner or a loser. So that's the trouble I have, because obviously all 198 countries in the world which are members of the UN cannot be winners. So the trouble is, we have to make a provision for losers, I think. Otherwise, the world will become a difficult place. We are all interconnected, and that has to do with the Sustainable Development Goals as well. So if some countries are losers, I think some of us who are maybe, God willing, if we are more fortunate, we cannot ignore the rest of the world, because with the kind of interdependence in question, I don't think that is an option. But I would emphasize innovation and technology.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Now coming to the last question of the session, which is potential solutions and recommendations. And I would like to hear from all of you in brief, if you have any potential solutions, recommendations to mitigate the significant rise of protectionism and the overall economic tensions. So starting with you, Dr. Bassem.
Thank you very much. I think there is a very strong need for a dynamic, very active foreign direct investment policy. So we need to have a very clear industrial policy. In an economy like the UAE, for example, we have a comparative advantage of having oil. Actually, oil can produce more than 6,000 products. How many of these are produced in the UAE? So eventually thinking how many of these products are going to exist in the coming 30, 40, 50 years and investing in such products and exporting to the world because they have a comparative advantage. But eventually, since we are moving toward a substitution away from oil-based products, starting from now investing in the technology to produce alternative substitutes to all these goods that are being produced today with oil eventually based products, petrochemicals and so on. Once we identify this, and of course we have, the technology sector, digital AI is already very well advanced in the UAE, so I'm not going to delve into it. But when we go to the green transition, we all know there is a multi-billion, trillion investment gap here. And the UAE is in the forefront of trying to invest in these fields. So having some regulation, some tools that maybe we can draw from the experience of what happened during the COVID-19. We had a pandemic, so we can think of global warming as being, a global pandemic, and trying to think what are the policies that help supporting some of the economic sectors during this era. What can be replicated to support, for example, a sector like green? When it comes to FDI, very actively identifying the sectors and then identifying the major players worldwide in these sectors, the big companies or the new startups, engaging with them and inviting them, investing in them, having a joint venture to bring them to invest in the UAE, since the UAE have enough fund and enough support to make it happen, to be very active and work harder than usual to make it happen. This is my point. Thank you.
Moving to Your Excellency.
So 3 points very quickly. Number one is what we have been doing and will continue to do, which is signing more and more CEPAs. And those CEPAs are not the same across all countries. So each and every country has a different CEPA signed between it and the UAE based on the certain sectors and industries that you are specifically keen on, and the other country is okay with opening up its trade with the UAE when it comes to it. Of course, while taking into account that the trade balance would be negatively affected in one way or the other, depending on which country you're trading in. And this brings me to my second point, that the only way to mitigate that and make sure that the CEPA is actually generating more benefits than otherwise is to capture part of the value chain. And then this brings me to the third point, which is building that resilient supply chain in as many products as possible. We have seen what has happened with COVID-19. And then there was a focus on pharmaceuticals, protective equipment, so on and so forth. We have seen what happened with food commodities, and so food security became a big element and trying to diversify away from certain sources. And so when you connect all the three together, you would be extremely well positioned to navigate whatever comes next on a global scale.
Thank you, Excellency. To you.
So every crisis offers an opportunity. So the first rule would be never waste a crisis. Countries waste crisis, which is unfortunate. 1991, I want to tell your audience that India was broke. And for the first time in my life as a civil servant, I spent 36 years in the Indian diplomatic service. My salary was not paid. Imagine working for the government and the government doesn't pay you salary. One of the reasons you join the government is because you're getting your salary every month. Today, we have a foreign exchange reserve of $1 trillion. So if India can do it, I think it's important not to waste a crisis. We use that crisis to carry out economic reforms. I think for a country like India, which is not fortunate enough to have a lot of oil or uranium or whatever, I would say the people are the best assets, and therefore investment in education, especially quality education, is the way forward for India. Thank you.
Lastly, with you, Dr.
Okay, so first of all, the first advice is that don't think the current situation is going to last forever. Don't take sides. This is very important because you have different parties who have different sort of privileges under the current situation, but this is going to change because of number of things. If you think about China versus the West, which is, if we talk explicitly, this is the main sort of conflict, economic conflict right now. China has to open up its market, has to loosen the rules for foreign direct investment, and they are doing this. They mentioned that in the third plenum that been like a couple of, I think a month and a half ago. And they already did that. Within the last month, they opened up a certain part of the financial industry and again for some industries for foreign investment. And at the same time, for multinationals, I'm talking about companies in the West, they have a sort of an advantage to be able to access the Chinese market. So they're gonna put pressure on their governments not to lose this market for them. Plus, there are definitely there are areas of integration. China needs, for example, the EU as a market for its EVs, because, for example, EVs in the EU, they have the best infrastructure. So they have a ready-made market. Just imagine that if you're selling your EVs in Europe versus Africa. So Europe for them is a big market. But at the same time, the European car manufacturing companies, they need the Chinese technology in batteries, for example. So because of this situation, this going to be solved somehow. They will reach a sort of compromise. So for you, you have to predict this. You have to think a couple of steps ahead and to know exactly what's going to, not exactly, but to have a sort of a vision of how you can integrate with both. You don't sacrifice one for the other. This is the first thing. The second thing for most of the countries is that we don't have all to be competing in high tech. Okay, there are areas for small firms, for regional integration, for some new advancement in technologies concerning agriculture and things like that, and you have to work through it. So again, there are sort of opportunities, there are sort of way out, not for every country, unfortunately, but at least if you think carefully and if you plan ahead, then maybe you will get out of this. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen. We have to leave it there. Everyone, please join me in thanking our